Bart Ehrman might be the most recognizable New Testament scholar on the face of the planet, but when it comes to the Gospels, I wouldn't trust Bart any more than I would trust gas station sushi. That doesn't mean that he's always wrong, he just constantly needs to be fact-checked. Just because he's a renowned biblical scholar doesn't mean that you can always take him at his word. Here is a minute-long clip of Bart on the MythVision Podcast exploiting the ignorance of his audience.
Ah, boy, here we go.
A lot of people on the kind of more skeptical side of reading things say that Mark doesn't have a resurrection narrative. It's not true. Mark does have a resurrection narrative. The women go to the tomb after Jesus has been buried. They go on the third day, and the tomb's empty. A young man there tells them that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and they're supposed to go tell the disciples that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. Verse 8 of chapter 16 says, "And the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid." Boom, and and so Jesus is definitely raised. There's a resurrection narrative. What there's not are appearances of Jesus to the disciples afterwards. In Matthew, they go off and tell the disciples, and the disciples go up to Galilee and they meet Jesus there. It's just the opposite.
We are laughing.
So Bart wants to create a contradiction by having the women in Mark never say a word to anyone. It's as if Mark was shutting the curtain and saying, "All right, show's over, everybody." But Mark saying that the women said nothing to anyone for they were afraid following the discovery of the empty tomb doesn't necessarily mean they didn't tell the disciples. Mark says that they were specifically told to tell the disciples and Peter of what they saw. While their fear may have initially prevented them from spreading the report widely among unbelieving Jews, it's psychologically implausible that they would have remained completely silent about such a monumental event. Now, obviously, Mark implies that they found out from the women at some point because, after all, he is writing about it. That's just common sense, and even Ehrman himself admits as much. But did Mark really intend to end his gospel at verse 8, like Ehrman says?
Well, that's debatable.
Nearly all scholars now agree that the long ending of Mark, from verse 9 through 20, wasn't part of the original text. That's not at all controversial, but there is some disagreement among scholars regarding the question of whether Mark 16:8 was the original intended ending of the gospel. Several scholars believe that verse 8 represents a place where the narrative was cut off, either was never finished for some reason, or the original conclusion was lost. So why do some scholars think that? Let's take a look at the passage again. They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So how would we expect Mark if he were to continue here? In order to understand, we need to take a look at the way that Mark normally writes. He has a pattern of making blanket statements before adding an exception. Let's take a look at a few passages. Mark 5:37 says, "He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother." Mark 9:8 says, "Suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus." Mark 9:9 says, "As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one what they had seen till the Son of Man had risen from the dead." Mark 10:18, "Why do you call me good?" Jesus asked him. "No one is good except God alone." And Mark 13:32, "Now concerning the day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father." So what does this suggest about the ending of Mark's gospel? It's entirely plausible that the original ending of the gospel ran something like this. "And they told no one, for they were afraid, but running to the disciples, they told them all that they had seen and heard." Well then, that sounds a lot like Matthew 28:8. But Ehrman wants to create an impression that Mark is contradicting Matthew here. But there's more that we could add here. In Mark's gospel, we see a repeated pattern of silence or requested silence, followed by proclamation. This silence in Mark's gospel never sticks. For example, in Mark 1:44, a leper is charged to say nothing to any man, but is also instructed to go and show himself to the priest. But Mark says that he shouted his healing so loudly that Jesus couldn't even enter into town openly. Similarly, when Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead, those present were told not to broadcast the miracle, but it's clear that the people in the house who witnessed the event couldn't be prevented from discussing what they saw. Furthermore, in Mark 7:24, we're told that Jesus entered a house and would have no man know it, but the fact of his arrival couldn't be hidden. Finally, when Mark reports that Peter, James, and John were instructed not to share what they saw on the Mount of Transfiguration, he does not suggest that the rest of the 12 were also meant to be excluded from the revelation for forever. New Testament scholar Robert Stein also contends that Mark did not intend to end his gospel at 16:8 because it would leave unfulfilled prophetic statements and shift the focus away from Jesus, which goes against the highly Christological nature of the gospel. It's for these reasons and others that scholars like Hort, Gundry, Witherington, Wright, Croy, and Edwards think that Mark 16:8 represents a spot where the narrative was interrupted, never completed, or lost. But for one reason or another, Bart never clues his audience in on this. Instead, he chooses to turn this into a contradiction. Rather than letting his audience know that there's some scholarly debate about this, he presents it as if it's the only view that scholars know about. Now you might say to yourself, come on, Eric, cut the guy some slack. Just because he's a scholar doesn't mean that he's just read everybody on this particular topic. Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but Ehrman cannot plead ignorance here. The view that I'm discussing was also the view of Dr. Bruce Metzger. Metzger was probably one of the best-known textual critics on the planet. More importantly, he supervised Ehrman's doctoral dissertation at Princeton. They even co-wrote a book together. It's this book, The Text of the New Testament. What does it say in the 4th edition on pages 325 through 326? Metzger writes, "But did Mark intend to conclude his gospel with the melancholy statement that the women were afraid? Despite the arguments which several modern scholars have urged in support of such a view, the present writer cannot believe that the note of fear would have been regarded as an appropriate conclusion to an account of the evangel or good news." Metzger goes on to write that from a stylistic point of view, the end of a Greek sentence with the word gar is extremely unusual and incredibly rare. Only a few examples have been found throughout the vast range of Greek literary works, and no instance has been found where gar stands at the end of a book. This is the 4th edition of the book. In the original 3 editions, Metzger was the sole author, but Ehrman was added as a co-author in the 4th edition. So Ehrman absolutely knows better here.
Well. How the turntables.
So why is Ehrman leaving out inconvenient facts? Ehrman has been talking about this contradiction since Jesus Interrupted came out about 14 years ago, and he's still repeating it to this day. I'm constantly being told by atheists that non-Christian scholars are basically like Spock. They're just researching the objective facts and giving you the real story. They're never hiding anything. Right. Listen, the whole point of this is not to rag on Bart or say that he's just a terrible human being. He's a mixed bag just like the rest of us. Some of us are just a little more mixed up than others. The whole point of this is that you can't just take a scholar's word for it and assume that they're just giving you the totally unbiased truth. You have to cross-check people's claims, whether they're Christians, agnostics, atheists, or whatever. Do your own homework. I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you so much for watching.